"Marry me, Mr. Blackwood." Clara Whitmore said it loud enough for the whole street to hear, and Raven Creek went silent as a held breath. The preacher froze. The merchants stared. Every man who had ever crossed to the other side of the road to avoid Elias Blackwood suddenly couldn't look away. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't afraid. She was the only person in this valley who knew the truth about the man they all called a monster. And she was betting everything on it. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he said 4 words nobody in that crowd expected to hear from the most feared cowboy alive. "I'll keep you safe." Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Wyoming Territory, 1883. There were things people in Raven Creek Valley knew as surely as they knew the winter came hard and the summer ran short. They knew the creek flooded every April. They knew the Harmon brothers cheated at cards. They knew Pastor Gilroy drank more whiskey than he preached against. And they knew every man, woman, and child within 40 miles that Elias Blackwood was not a man you approached. Not a man you spoke to unless you had no other choice. Not a man whose land you crossed after dark, whose name you said too loudly in mixed company, whose eyes you held for longer than half a second, if you happened to cross paths with him in town. Elias Blackwood was the kind of man that stories grew up around. The way vines grew up around dead trees. Wild. Thick. Impossible to cut back once they'd taken hold. People said he'd killed a man in Colorado with his bare hands over a stolen horse. People said he'd run an entire family off their homestead just because their fence line crossed 3 feet into his property. People said he didn't sleep, that he walked his land at night like something that didn't belong to the daylight hours. People said a lot of things about Elias Blackwood. Clara Whitmore had heard every single one of them. And she'd walked into the center of Raven Creek on a Tuesday morning anyway, found him standing outside the general store with a list of supplies in his hand and dust on his coat, and she'd said what she said. Right there in front of God and the whole town. Sure, she hadn't planned it to happen that way. That wasn't entirely accurate. She had planned it. She'd been planning it for 3 weeks, ever since she'd made up her mind. But she hadn't planned for it to happen in front of witnesses. She'd intended to ride out to his property, knock on his door, make her case in private, where the answer, whatever it was, would be between the two of them. But then her horse had thrown a shoe 2 miles outside of town. Then the man who was supposed to fix it had been busy until afternoon. Then Clara had walked into town to wait, and there he was. Elias Blackwood in the flesh, close enough to speak to. And Clara had thought, if I don't say it now, I will talk myself out of it by sundown. She'd never been particularly good at doing things the sensible way. So she walked up to him, and she said it. "Mr. Blackwood." He turned. His eyes were the color of a storm coming in from the north, gray-green and flat, and giving away absolutely nothing. He was taller than she remembered, broader across the shoulders. He had a scar along his jaw that she didn't think had been there the last time she'd seen him, or maybe she just hadn't noticed it. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was low, even. He said her name like he was simply acknowledging a fact. "I want you to marry me," Clara said. The words came out clean and clear and completely without the tremor she'd spent 3 weeks trying to rehearse away. For 2 full seconds, Elias Blackwood didn't react at all. He simply looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and his supply list in his hand and his complete, absolute stillness. Then, "I'm sorry," he said, not surprised, not offended, just checking, making sure he'd heard correctly. "I want you to marry me," Clara said again. And the repetition made it more real, made it settle into the air between them, with a weight she could almost feel pressing against her sternum. "I've thought about it carefully. I have reasons. I'd like to explain them to you if you're willing to hear them." Elias looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked up. Around them, Raven Creek had gone completely, utterly, breathlessly silent. Margaret Hendricks had stopped sweeping her porch steps and was standing with the broom held sideways in both hands, mouth open. Deputy Crawford had frozen in the middle of the street with one boot raised mid-step. 3 men outside the saloon had turned as one like sunflowers tracking a very unusual sun. Pastor Gilroy was standing at the top of the church steps with his Bible held against his chest, and an expression on his face like he wasn't entirely sure this wasn't some kind of theological test. Elias looked at all of them. Then he looked back at Clara. "All right," he said. "All right, you'll listen," she said. "Or all right, All right, I'll listen." He glanced around at the audience they'd collected. "Not here." He took her to the far end of the street around the side of the feed store, where the overhang cut the wind and the nearest set of ears was far enough away that a person couldn't hear without actively trying. Clara was aware keenly that at least 4 people were actively trying. "Go ahead," Elias said. He'd folded his supply list and tucked it into his coat pocket. He stood with his arms at his sides, not crossed, not defensive, just still. Waiting. Clara had rehearsed this part. She'd rehearsed it lying awake at night and walking the road to the Miller farm where she'd been working since October and hanging laundry in the cold morning air. She had a version that was practical and measured and laid out the logic in clean, sensible terms. What came out was none of that. "You saved my life last February," she said. "On the mountain road. You remember." It wasn't a question. She could tell from the slight shift in his expression that he remembered. "A lot of people would have kept riding," she said. "It was cold. It was dark. I was a stranger. You didn't know me from anyone. You could have told yourself it wasn't your problem, and nobody would have blamed you for it. But you stopped." Elias said nothing. "You gave me your coat," she continued, "and your food, and you carried me the last half-mile to shelter, and when I woke up the next morning, you were already gone. You didn't wait for me to thank you. You didn't want anything for it. You just did it and left." "I didn't need thanks," Elias said. "No," Clara said. "That's exactly my point." She looked at him directly. She'd practiced this part especially. "I have a very practical problem, Mr. Blackwood. My father's farm is gone sold for debts 2 months before he died, and there was nothing left after the creditors were done. I've been working at the Miller place since autumn, but Dorothy Miller's sister is coming from Ohio in the spring, and they won't need an extra hand anymore. I have no family, no property, very little money, and the options available to a woman in my situation in this territory are limited. You could go east," Elias said. "You could go to a city." "I could," Clara said. "Or I could ask the only man I've met in the last 2 years who I genuinely believe would treat me fairly." That landed differently than she expected. Something moved across his face, not quite pain, not quite surprise. Something she didn't have a name for yet. "You don't know me, Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice had shifted, gone lower, more careful. "You know one night on a mountain road in a snowstorm? That's not knowing a person." "No?" Clara agreed. "That's why I'm proposing practical terms rather than declarations of affection. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to consider a partnership. I can work. I know ranching. My father raised cattle for 20 years, and I worked alongside him for most of them. I can cook. I can manage accounts. I can handle whatever needs handling. In return, I'd have a roof and standing, and you'd have someone to share the work." She paused. "That's the proposal." Elias was quiet for a long moment. "You know what they say about me," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I know what they say," Clara said. "I also know what I saw." "Why?" He didn't give her an answer that day. He told her he needed to think. He asked her to give him 3 days, and then he asked how to reach her. The Miller farm. She told him East Road, the house with the green shutters, and then he collected his supplies from the store, and he left. Clara walked back through the center of town with her chin up and her hands steady, and she was aware of every single pair of eyes following her, and she did not look at any of them. She made it around the corner of the millinery shop before she leaned against the wall and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere around her ankles. That went either very well or very badly, she thought. There's no way to know which one yet. Margaret Hendricks found her there approximately 40 seconds later. "Clara Whitmore, Margaret said in the tone of a woman who has witnessed a catastrophe and needs to fully process it out loud. Did you just walk up to Elias Blackwood and ask him to marry you, in the middle of Main Street in front of everyone? I did, Clara said. Have you lost your mind? Margaret said. She didn't say it meanly. She said it the way a person asks a question they genuinely, desperately need answered. That man, Clara, do you know what they say about him? Do you know what he's supposed to have done in— I know what people say, Clara said. I also know that when I was freezing to death on the Raven Pass Road last February, Elias Blackwood was the only person who stopped. Margaret went quiet. He gave me his coat, Margaret. He shared his food. He didn't leave until I was safe, and he didn't ask for a single thing in return. Not even my name. Clara straightened up from the wall. Now, if there's a man in this valley who would have done the same, tell me his name, and I'll go propose to him instead. Margaret didn't have an answer for that. Nobody who heard the story later could find a good answer for it either. The 3 days passed with the slowness of 3 years. Clara worked. She woke before dawn and helped Dorothy Miller with the morning chores, and tried not to think about what she would do if the answer was no. She had been honest with Elias. Her situation was genuinely precarious, but she hadn't told him quite everything. She hadn't told him that 3 separate men in Raven Creek had already come to her with their own version of an offer. That one of them was Roger Dunn, who owned the lumber operation, and whose wife had died the previous spring, and who'd made it clear in terms that were polite on the surface and deeply unsettling underneath, that he'd be very willing to provide for a woman in Clara's position if Clara was willing to provide certain things in return. She hadn't told Elias that Roger Dunn was also the wealthiest man in the county, and the reason she was no longer welcome at the church sewing circle because she'd declined his offer a second time, less politely than she'd declined it the first time, and he was not a man who responded well to being told no. She hadn't told him any of that because it would have sounded like she was asking him to rescue her, and she wasn't. She was asking him for a partnership, a fair arrangement, an agreement between 2 people who both needed something. She had meant every word she'd said to him. She didn't need rescuing. She needed a reasonable man. She just hoped he would be one. On the second day, Dorothy Miller sat down across from her at breakfast and said very carefully, I heard about what you did in town. Word travels fast, Clara said. In this town, it travels faster than that. Dorothy wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She was a kind woman, Dorothy Miller, practical and plain-spoken, and not given to drama. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, she said. I don't know Elias Blackwood well enough to tell you you're wrong, but I want you to know if he says no, you're not out of a place to stay. My sister's coming, yes, but we'll make room until you figure something out. I want you to know that. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. Thank you, Dorothy. Don't thank me, just eat your eggs. Dorothy stood up, then she paused. What I will say is this. The people in this town have believed things about Elias Blackwood for a long time, and most of them have never spoken more than 10 words to the man. If you've seen something different— She shook her head slightly. Sometimes the person who looks from a different angle is the only one who sees the truth. She went back to the stove without another word. Clara ate her eggs and thought about mountain roads and coats, given without conditions, and the sound of boots crunching through snow in the dark. On the 3rd day, just before noon, a horse came down the east road and stopped in front of the Miller farm. Elias Blackwood knocked on the door, and Clara answered it, and he stood there in the pale winter sunlight with his hat in his hands, and his expression as unreadable as it always was, and he said, I've thought about your proposal. And, Clara said, and I have my own terms, he said, if you're willing to hear them. I am. He laid them out plainly, the way she'd laid out her own. He'd need her to understand that his reputation meant certain things that people in town would talk, that life on the ranch was not comfortable, in the way a townhouse was comfortable, that winters were hard, and the work was constant, and some days felt longer than they had any right to. He'd need her to understand that he paused here, searching for the word difficult. He'd never learned how to be otherwise, and he didn't expect to change. I'm not asking you to change, Clara said. "I'm not finished," he said. She waited. "If you're in my house," he said slowly, like he was building something piece by piece, "then what's mine is yours. You won't be a servant. You won't be a charity case. You'll have a say in decisions. You'll have your own money for your own things. You'll be treated with respect." He held her gaze. "Those are my terms." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Those are very good terms," she said. Something shifted in his face, barely just the faintest loosening around the corners of his eyes. Not a smile, not yet, but the place where a smile might eventually be. "There's something else," he said. "Tell me." "I'll keep you safe," he said. "From whatever comes. That's not a term, that's a promise. You should know what you're getting if you come to my land." The way he said it wasn't romantic. It wasn't flowery or tender, or designed to make a woman feel swept away. It was simply what it was, a direct statement of intent from a man who had spent a very long time meaning exactly what he said. "I'll keep you safe." And Clara, who had heard plenty of pretty words from men who meant none of them, understood that she had just heard something that was worth more than all of them put together. "Then we have a deal, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "Elias," he said. "If we're going to be married, it should be Elias." They were married 4 days later. Pastor Gilroy performed the ceremony with the expression of a man who has agreed to do something he doesn't entirely understand, but cannot find a scriptural reason to refuse. The witnesses were Dorothy Miller and her husband because they were the only people who came. The rest of the town was invited. The rest of the town declined. Afterward, Clara rode out to the ranch in the seat of Elias's wagon, with her 2 bags of belongings packed in the back, and for the first few miles, neither of them spoke. The land opened up around them as they traveled, wider and rougher than the valley floor, the mountains pushing up against the sky, the winter grass lying flat under a thin crust of old snow. "Are you frightened?" Elias asked. It wasn't a taunt. It wasn't a challenge. He asked it the same way he asked everything, flat and direct, like he simply wanted the true answer. Clara thought about it honestly. "A little," she said. "Are you?" A long pause. "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him, surprised. His eyes were on the road ahead. "I haven't had anyone on the property in a long time," he said. "I've been alone for a long time. I don't know how to—" He stopped. Tried again. "I'm better with cattle than with people." "I've met some cattle," Clara said. "They're not bad company." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Very small, very quick. But she saw it. That was enough. The ranch was nothing like what she'd imagined. She'd expected something dark, something that matched the stories, a place that looked like the people who feared it said. It looked grim, fortress-like. The kind of homestead that set a person's teeth on edge before they'd even stepped through the door. What she found instead was a working ranch that had been maintained by a single pair of hands for longer than it should have been. The house itself was solid, good timber, good stone foundation, but there were places where the attention of a second person was clearly missing. An interior that had no softness to it, nothing unnecessary, nothing purely for comfort or pleasure. Everything functional, everything chosen for use rather than beauty, and everywhere, little signs of care that no one would have thought to notice unless they were paying attention. The barn was meticulously clean. The horses were in excellent condition, their stalls banked with fresh hay. A mama cat near the woodpile had a bowl of food and water that had been recently filled. A loose shutter on the south side of the house had been mended so recently the wood was still bright where it had been nailed. He takes care of things, Clara thought, standing in the middle of the kitchen that evening and looking around. He takes care of things that don't thank him and can't tell anyone he did it. She'd carried her bags inside herself. Elias had offered to help. She'd taken one and given him the other. He'd accepted this without comment. "I'll show you your room," he said. It was a small bedroom off the main hall, clean spare, a quilt on the bed that was visibly older but well mended. He'd made it up for her, she realized. Recently. The pillow was freshly beaten. This was someone else's room before, he said and stopped. She waited. My daughter's, he said, very quietly. She didn't. He stopped again. His jaw was tight. It hasn't been used in a long time. I thought it should be used. Clara set her bag down on the floor. Thank you, she said. And she meant it with everything she had. He nodded once. Dinner's at 7. I cook plain. I'll help, she said. You don't have to. I know, she said. I want to. That night they ate beans and salt pork and cornbread at a table big enough for 6, just the two of them, and the silence between them was not the hostile silence of strangers who resented each other. It was the tentative quiet of two very cautious people, learning whether the space between them was safe. Clara asked him about the property, the acreage, the herd, the grazing patterns. He answered her questions directly and fully, without padding, without condescension. She asked him which of the cattle had injured a leg she'd seen him favoring a roan heifer during evening feed. He stared at her for a half-second. You notice that? I've been watching cattle since I was 9, she said. He told her about the heifer. Then he told her about the rest of the herd. Then, at some point that Clara couldn't pinpoint precisely, he stopped telling her facts and started telling her things he clearly hadn't told anyone in a very long time. About the calving troubles he'd had last spring. About the fence line on the north boundary that he'd been meaning to reinforce before another winter hit. About the pasture that had gone dry in August and the extra miles the cattle had to walk for water. Clara listened to all of it. The lantern burned low between them. Outside, the wind had come up, that long-cutting Wyoming wind that Clara knew better than to argue with. But inside the kitchen, it was warm. It was, Clara thought, perhaps the most honest conversation she'd had in years. 3 weeks passed. In 3 weeks, the town of Raven Creek watched and waited and did what small towns do when they cannot understand something. They talked about it. They speculated. They built theories out of whatever scraps of information they could gather. Margaret Hendricks reported that she'd ridden past the Blackwood property on a Wednesday and seen Clara hanging laundry in the yard without any visible signs of distress. Dorothy Miller said she'd received a note from Clara saying she was settling in fine and that the roan heifer was recovering well. Deputy Crawford had no official reports. Nothing broken, nothing burned, nobody bleeding. This frustrated certain people considerably. Roger Dunn was not a man who could tolerate being made to look foolish, and Clara Whitmore, choosing Elias Blackwood over any of the options available to her in Raven Creek over him, was in Roger Dunn's understanding of the world an act of profound personal insult. He sat in his office on the ground floor of the lumber operation and turned this insult over in his mind for 3 weeks. He was still turning it over when Harlan Voss knocked on his door. Harlan Voss was not in the classical sense a good man. He was not the worst man Roger Dunn had ever employed, but that was a lower bar than it appeared to be. What Harlan was good at was finding and using information, the kind of information that people didn't want found or used. He had a talent for it that Roger had found useful on a number of occasions. "You wanted to see me," Harlan said. "Tell me everything you know about Elias Blackwood," Roger said. Harlan smiled, and the thing that had been building in Raven Creek, slow and invisible and patient as a fire in a wall, began to move. Clara found out about it on a Thursday. She'd come into town for supplies, their first real shortage, the coffee and flour running low, and she'd been in the general store when she overheard Martin Fikes, who ran the feed operation, telling someone that he'd heard from a very reliable source that Elias Blackwood had been responsible for a man's death over in Carbon County. She stood still between the shelves and listened. Not death in a fair fight. Death through negligence, Martin was saying. A fire on a neighbor's property 3 years back, and Elias had known about it and done nothing, and 2 people had died. "That's not true," Clara said. Both men turned to look at her. "I'm sorry," Martin said. "What you just said," Clara said, turning to face him directly, her basket on her arm and her voice perfectly steady. "That's not true." "Well, now I heard it from someone who told you," Clara said. Martin's mouth worked. I'm not sure exactly where it... Because I'd like to know, Clara said. I'd like to know exactly who told you that story, because I'd like to go speak to them and find out where they heard it. Rumors about my husband concern me. The word husband landed in the conversation like a stone in still water, sending rings out in every direction. Martin Fikes looked uncomfortable. Clara bought her supplies and walked out of the store. On the wagon ride home, her hands were steady on the reins, and her mind was working very, very carefully. Someone was building something against Elias. She didn't know who yet. She didn't know why. But she understood with a certainty that settled somewhere deep and cold in the center of her chest, that it had been building for longer than 3 weeks, maybe longer than anyone knew. And she understood something else. She had come to Elias's ranch looking for a fair arrangement. What she'd found instead was a man who had spent years being carved away by people who never bothered to learn the truth about him. She had made him a promise too, even if she'd never said it aloud. She was going to keep it. She told him that night. She laid it out plainly, the way he laid things out, what she'd heard, where she'd heard it, what she thought it meant. She watched his face while she talked, and she watched the shutters come down behind his eyes, the way they always did when the outside world pushed in on him. "It's nothing new," he said when she finished. "Someone is actively spreading this story," she said. "That's different from old rumors." "Maybe?" His voice was flat. Careful. "Elias." She waited until he looked at her. "Tell me about the fire." A long silence. "You don't have to," she said, "but I'd like to know if you're willing." He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down his coffee cup and he told her. 3 years ago. A ranch 2 miles from his property. A family named Castor, father, mother, 3 children. A fire that started in the barn on a February night and spread to the house before anyone could stop it. 2 of the Castor children had made it out. The youngest had not. "I was the first one there," Elias said. "I'd seen the smoke from my ridge. I rode over." His jaw tightened. "I went into that house twice. I got 2 of the children out. The third one..." He stopped. Clara waited. "I couldn't find her," he said. "The smoke was... I couldn't..." Another long stop. "I had to come out. I couldn't..." "Elias," Clara said quietly. "I couldn't save her," he said. And the Castor family needed someone to blame because there was nothing else to do with what had happened to them. And I was there, and so they blamed me. He exhaled. I don't fault them for it. They lost their little girl. People have to put grief somewhere." Clara looked at the man sitting across from her. The man who had gone into a burning building twice, who had saved 2 children and carried the third one with him like a wound ever since. The man everyone called dangerous. The man everyone called unfeeling. "Is that when you came here?" she asked. "After, is that when you left wherever you were before?" "I'd already been here 2 years when it happened," he said. "But after, yes. I pulled back further. Stopped going into town more than I had to. Stopped trying to..." He shook his head. "It wasn't worth it. Every time I tried to be part of something, I just gave people more material for more stories." "You can't live like that forever," Clara said. "I was doing fine," he said. "You were surviving," she said. "That's not the same as fine." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said very quietly. "I suppose it isn't." That night, after Elias had gone to bed, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the lantern burning low and thought about all of it. She thought about what it cost a person to keep going after the world had decided who they were and refused to look again. She thought about the way Elias moved through his own life, careful and contained and watchful, like a man who had learned that open spaces invited attack. She thought about the little girl in the barn. She thought about a man who had gone in twice and barely come out himself. She thought about the town that had never asked. And she thought about Roger Dunn. though she didn't have his name yet. She didn't have his name. But she had the shape of him, the kind of man who moved through the world taking things and who punished anyone who wouldn't give. She had met that shape before. She knew what it wanted. The lantern guttered in a draft from under the door. Clara reached out and turned the flame up. Outside, the Wyoming wind pushed against the windows with its long, cold shoulder. Inside the house was warm. She had made a deal with a difficult man. She intended to honor it, and if someone was coming for what belonged to them, she'd be ready. The agreement they'd made was simple. He would keep her safe. She hadn't promised him the same, but she would. The first thing Clara learned about living with Elias Blackwood was that he woke before the sun and started working before most people had opened their eyes. The second thing she learned was that he never made noise about it. No heavy boots on the floor. No slamming of doors. No clattering in the kitchen that announced his presence the way some men announced everything they did, needing the world to know they were up and moving and contributing to the morning. Elias simply rose dressed and went to work quiet as smoke leaving the house so gently that the first 3 mornings Clara slept straight through and didn't hear him go. On the 4th morning, she set herself to wake at 4:30 and was already dressed when she heard him moving in the hall. She came out of her room and he stopped in the darkness between them. "You don't have to be up this early," he said. "I told you I wanted to help," she said. A pause. "All right." He turned and went toward the door, and she followed him, and that was the end of that conversation. She fell into the rhythm of the ranch the way water finds its level, not forced, not performed, just gradually finding where it fit. She took over the kitchen entirely within the first week, not because Elias couldn't cook, but because she was faster, and she liked it, and he clearly didn't, and he accepted this transfer of territory without a word of argument. She took on the accounts and the supply lists and the tracking of inventory because she had a head for numbers that she'd learned alongside her father, and because it quickly became obvious that Elias had been managing all of it in his head for so long that writing things down felt unnecessary to him, which meant things were occasionally and dangerously not where he thought they were. "You were going to run out of salt before February," she told him one evening, looking up from the ledger she'd started. He looked at her from across the table. "I've never run out of salt." "You would have this year," she said. "You bought the same amount you always buy, but you've got 2 more head than you did last winter, and you've been using more for the curing." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll go into town Thursday. I already put it on the list," she said, and went back to the ledger. Another silence. "Clara." She looked up. "Thank you," he said. Simple. Direct. Like everything he said. She'd noticed that about him, that he didn't use words he didn't mean. He didn't say thank you as punctuation or reflex. When he said it, he meant it completely, and somehow that made 2 words carry more weight than most people's speeches. "You're welcome," she said. What she didn't tell him was that the trip into town Thursday was also when she intended to start pulling at the thread she'd found. She'd been thinking about it since the conversation in the general store. Martin Fikes hadn't known where the story about the Carbon County fire had come from. That much she believed. Martin wasn't a bad man, just a man who repeated things without checking them first, the way most people did. The story had come to him the way stories always came, as if they'd always existed, as if they'd grown naturally from the air rather than being planted by someone specific with something specific to gain. But stories didn't grow from air. Someone had told Martin Fikes. Someone had told that person. And if Clara followed the thread carefully enough, it would eventually lead somewhere. She went to town Thursday with the supply list and her eyes open. She stopped at the general store first. Bill Archer behind the counter was courteous to her, more courteous than she might have expected, which told her that either his feelings about her marriage had shifted, or he was too practical a businessman to let them affect a paying customer. She handed him the list, and while he was pulling items, she asked carefully and conversationally whether he'd heard anything new about the Blackwood property. Bill Archer's hands slowed slightly on the shelf. "Can't say that I have," he said. "Funny," Clara said. Martin Fikes was telling someone in here last week about some business over in Carbon County. I was wondering where that story got started." Bill Archer turned to look at her. He was a careful man, careful in the way that people who worked with money tended to be careful, and he was weighing something behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. "I wouldn't know about Martin's sources," he said. "No," Clara said pleasantly. "Of course not. What do I owe you?" She paid for the supplies and went out. She had one more stop to make, and it was the one she'd been least looking forward to. Harlan Voss drank at the saloon in the late mornings when he thought no one who mattered was watching. Clara had learned this from Dorothy Miller, who had learned it from her husband, who had seen it enough times to consider it a reliable fact. Clara walked into the saloon at 10:30. 3 men at the bar turned to look at her. Women who entered the saloon alone at 10:30 in Raven Creek were either very desperate or very determined, and Clara wore the look of the latter so plainly that nobody said anything to her as she crossed to the table where Harlan Voss was sitting with a half-empty glass, and the look of a man who was waiting for something. "Mr. Voss," she said, and sat down across from him without being invited. Harlan Voss was a lean, lank-haired man somewhere between 40 and 50, with pale eyes that didn't stay still. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's trying to calculate the value of. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, and smiled. "That's a strange thing to say. I keep expecting someone else when I hear that name." "I imagine you do," Clara said. "I'd like to ask you something, and I'd like you to answer me honestly." Harlan's smile didn't move. "I'll do my best. Who told you about the fire in Carbon County?" The smile stayed exactly where it was, but something behind Harlan's pale eyes went very flat and very still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said. "I think you are," Clara said. "Someone started a story about my husband in this town, and I'm tracing where it came from. Martin Fikes heard it from someone, and I think that someone might have heard it from you." Harlan took a long drink from his glass. "That's a lot of supposition for a woman who's only been in this valley a few months." "I'm a quick study," Clara said. "I'd be careful," Harlan said, and now the smile was entirely gone, and his voice had taken on a quality she recognized, the quality that certain men's voices got when they wanted you to understand something without them having to say it plainly. Raven Creek is a small town. There are people in it who've been here a long time, who have relationships that go back a long way. A new wife asking questions about things that don't concern her could find herself with fewer friends than she started with. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I married a man who this town has been punishing for things he didn't do. I don't particularly care about being popular. What I care about is finding out who's been building a case against my husband and why." She stood up. "If that's you, I'd strongly suggest you stop. And if it's someone you're working for, I'd suggest you pass that message along." She walked out of the saloon without looking back. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached the wagon. She gripped the seat until they stopped. She'd gotten what she came for. Harlan Voss had not denied it. She didn't tell Elias about the saloon visit. Not yet. Not because she was keeping things from him, but because she didn't have enough yet. She had the shape of the problem, but not its name, and she'd learned from her father that you don't tell a person the barn is on fire until you're sure of where the fire is. You don't want them running in the wrong direction. What she did instead was watch and listen and think. She watched the way the town talked about Elias, and she started to notice a pattern that the stories about him, the ones people repeated most, all had a particular quality to them. They were just specific enough to seem credible, but just vague enough to be impossible to disprove. They mentioned places and incidents without dates. They referenced witnesses who were always just far enough away or long enough gone to be unreachable. They were the stories of someone who knew how rumors worked, who knew how to build them so they held their shape under examination. That was not the work of a drunk at a bar repeating things he'd heard. That was deliberate. That was construction. 2 weeks after the saloon visit, she found out it was Roger Dunn. She didn't find it out through investigation. She found it out because Dorothy Miller came to the ranch on a cold Wednesday afternoon and sat across from Clara with her hands wrapped around a teacup and her face carrying something she'd clearly been carrying for a while. "I should have told you sooner," Dorothy said. "Told me what?" Clara said. Dorothy set down the teacup. "Roger Dunn came to see Frank last week. He wanted Frank to sign a letter. A letter saying he'd seen Elias Blackwood act aggressively toward 2 different men in the past year. Just sign it and add his name to it." Clara went very still. "What did Frank say?" "Frank told him no." Dorothy looked up. "Clara, Frank has never particularly liked Elias. You know how men are old grudges about nothing, but he told Roger no, and he told him if he came back about it, Frank would mention the visit to the sheriff." She paused. Roger was not pleased. "No," Clara said. "I imagine not. He's collecting names," Dorothy said. "Signatures. I don't know what he plans to do with them, but he's building something." "He wants the land," Clara said. Dorothy blinked. "What?" "He wants Elias's land. I'd guess he's been trying to get it for years, and Elias won't sell, so now he's trying a different approach. If he can convince enough people that Elias is dangerous, unstable, a threat, he might be able to get the county to move against him somehow. Force a sale, or just drive him out entirely." The words landed in the kitchen air between them and stayed there. "Can he do that?" Dorothy said quietly. "Not if he doesn't have the signatures," Clara said. Dorothy nodded once. "Then I thought you should know." Clara reached across the table and gripped Dorothy's hand briefly. "Thank you, truly." After Dorothy left, Clara sat in the kitchen for a long time and let herself feel the full weight of it. Roger Dunn was a wealthy man with connections and time and a particular talent for patience. He had probably been working this slowly for months, maybe longer, building the case piece by piece, adding to the story that already existed about Elias, thickening it and deepening it until it became the kind of narrative that could justify action. And Elias didn't know, or she thought, and the thought made something sharp move through her chest. Maybe he did know, in the way a person knows something they've been trying not to look at directly. The way he'd said, "It's nothing new," when she'd mentioned the gossip. The way he'd retreated further and further inward year after year, as if he could make himself small enough that the world would stop being interested in destroying him. She was going to have to tell him, but first she needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with. She asked him about the land that night. She'd learned by then how to ask Elias questions, not directly at first, but circling in from the outside, the way you approach a horse that's been spooked. Give it space. Let it see you. Don't reach until it's ready. "How long have you owned this property?" she asked. 11 years. He didn't look up from the harness he was mending at the table. "And in those 11 years, has anyone tried to buy it from you?" His hands slowed. "Once or twice. Roger Dunn." The hands stopped. He put down the harness and looked at her. "Where did you hear that name?" "Is it true?" she said. A long pause. "He came to me 4 years ago, offered a price. I said no." "And 3 years ago," she said. "And the year after that," Elias's jaw was tight. "He sent someone else the second time. I said no again. The third time I didn't bother responding." He looked at her steadily. "What do you know, Clara?" She told him everything then. The general store, Harlan Voss, Dorothy's visit, what Roger Dunn was building, the letters, the signatures, the slow, systematic effort to paint Elias as something the county needed to remove. She told it plainly without softening it, because she'd learned that was what he needed, not protection from hard things, but someone willing to tell him the truth without flinching. When she finished, Elias was quiet for a very long time. "It makes sense," he said finally, and the flatness in his voice wasn't anger. It was something older and heavier than anger, the voice of a man who has spent so long being worn down that even confirmation comes without surprise. "I wondered the last few months before you came people were avoiding me more than usual. Stores taking longer to fill my orders. The blacksmith suddenly always busy when I needed work done. He shook his head slightly. I thought I was imagining it. You weren't imagining it, Clara said. No. He pushed back from the table and stood moving to the window, standing with his back to her. Clara, I should tell you something. She waited. When I agreed to your proposal, he said, I told myself it was practical. That was what I told myself. But there was another reason I said yes, and I think you should know it. Tell me, she said. He was quiet for a moment, still facing the window. I have been fighting this land alone for 11 years. Every time Dunn moved against me, I found a way to hold on, but the attrition of it gets harder every year. Having someone here who... He stopped, steadied. Having someone here changes things, not just practically. It changes what they can do. It's harder to drive out a family than a lone man that everyone already believes is dangerous. Clara looked at the back of his head and felt something clarify inside her. Something that had been soft and slightly uncertain, solidifying into shape. You married me partly to protect the ranch, she said. Yes. He turned to look at her. I thought you should know that. And I married you partly because Roger Dunn made my life in this valley unmanageable after I turned him down, she said. So I think we're even. He stared at her. He was one of the men I mentioned, the ones who came to me with their version of an offer, she said. The politely unsettling one. I declined twice. After the second time, the jobs started drying up and the invitations stopped coming, and the sewing circle decided they were full. She held his gaze steadily. We both married for practical reasons that were more complicated than we admitted. I don't think that means we made a bad deal. Elias was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between recognition and something raw and undefended that she thought maybe nobody had seen in him for a very long time. No, he said slowly. I don't think we did. Good, Clara said. Then let's talk about what we're going to do about Roger Dunn. What they were going to do about Roger Dunn required first understanding exactly what he had and exactly what he needed to make his case. They worked through it at the kitchen table, just the two of them, the way Clara had worked through accounts and supply lists, methodically going over each piece, finding the gaps. Roger Dunn needed documentation. Signatures. He was building the kind of case that required paper, because in 1883 Wyoming Territory, the way you removed a man from his property wasn't through violence, not openly, not a man like Roger Dunn who liked to keep his hands clean, it was through process. Through petitions and county officials, and the slow grind of administrative machinery. Who would sign a letter against you? Clara asked. Honestly, who in this valley has a real grievance, even a false one? Elias thought about it. Tom Garrett might. He blamed me for not warning him about a storm 2 years ago. His cattle drifted and he lost 6 head. He knows I couldn't have known, but he needed someone to blame. Who else? Harvey Cross. He thinks I reported him for grazing on county land. I didn't, but he's convinced I did. Did anyone? Elias paused. I don't know who reported it. Clara wrote both names down. Anyone else? Maybe 1 or 2, not many. That might not be enough for Dunn, Clara said. He'd need something more substantial to take to the county. A pattern. Official complaints. Something that looks more like a record than a list of rumors. He could manufacture one, Elias said. He could try, Clara said. But manufacturing official records is a different kind of risk than starting rumors. It crosses a line that most men like Dunn won't cross themselves. They get someone else to do that part. Harlan Voss, Elias said. That would be my guess, Clara said. They looked at each other across the table. There's another way to approach this, Clara said carefully. Instead of trying to defend against what he's building, instead of waiting for him to move and then reacting, we go forward. What does that mean? It means we make the thing he's trying to do harder, she said. He's working from the assumption that you're isolated, that no one in this valley will stand up for you because they've all been convinced you're dangerous. But if that's not true anymore... Clara, Tom Garrett's cattle, she said. Could we help him this winter? Practically not as a gesture, but actually help. The way you've been helping people quietly for years without letting anyone know. Elias stared at her. You know about that. I found the supply receipts, she said, for the families on the East Creek. And I talked to Dorothy, who mentioned that her husband's fence was mysteriously repaired last April while he was in town, and the only person with the materials and the skill to do it that quickly. I didn't want anyone making a thing of it, Elias said. I know you didn't, she said. But Elias, what you've been doing quietly for years and hoping no one notices, we need to start doing it loudly. He looked deeply uncomfortable. That's not I don't do things to be seen doing them. I know that, she said. I know that's not who you are. But the people who are coming for you are using the fact that you've been invisible. They're filling the silence with their own story about you. If we don't fill it with the true one, they win. A long silence. I don't know how to do that, he said. It cost him something to say it, she could see that. For a man who was good at everything physical and practical and demanding, admitting a gap was not natural. I do, Clara said. That's what I'm good at. People, conversations, understanding what someone needs to hear. She looked at him steadily. You're good at doing the right thing. I'm good at making sure people know it happened. Together. We're harder to fight, Elias said slowly. Yes, Clara said. He picked up the harness again, turned it over in his hands, put it down. All right, he said. The first test came sooner than either of them expected. 2 days later, word came through that old Pete Hansen, a widower who ran a small cattle operation 6 miles north, had lost a section of roof to the January wind, and with temperatures dropping hard, it was going to be a serious problem before he could get materials and labor together. Elias heard about it at the feed store. He came home, collected lumber and tools and rope, and told Clara he'd be back by nightfall. I'm coming, she said. He looked at her. I'm useful with a hammer, she said. And Pete Hansen is not a young man, and 1 pair of hands on a roof in January is dangerous. Another one of those pauses that she was learning to read, the pause where Elias was making a decision, that his instincts wanted to make one way, and something newer in him was making another. Dress warm, he said. Pete Hansen was a small, white-haired man who looked at them when they pulled up to his property with the expression of someone who couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He knew Elias not well, but the way everyone in the valley knew everyone, through enough years of proximity to recognize a face. He knew Clara even less. You came out here, Pete said. He was looking at Elias with something that wasn't quite suspicion, and wasn't quite gratitude, a man caught between 2 versions of the story he'd been told. Got word your roof was giving you trouble, Elias said. He was already climbing down from the wagon. We brought lumber. Where's the damage? Pete showed them. They worked for 4 hours in the cold, Elias on the roof, and Clara passing up materials, and Pete handing up tools and directing, and at the end of it the section was patched solid enough to hold through February. Pete made coffee, and they drank it inside while feeling came back into their fingers. I heard... Pete stopped, started again. People say things, in town. They do, Elias agreed. I've been one of the people saying them, Pete said. He was looking at the table. About you, about the Castor fire. Elias was quiet. What you did today? Pete shook his head. A man who is what they say you are doesn't do what you did today. A man like that does things quietly, Clara said, because he's learned that people aren't interested in the truth if they already have a story they like. Pete looked at her. Then he looked at Elias. Then he looked at his coffee. I won't be saying those things anymore, he said. That's all I've got to offer, but I won't be saying them anymore. Elias nodded once. That's enough. They drove home in the dark, the horses steady, the cold pressing in from all sides, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Thank you, Elias said finally, for coming today. You already thanked me, Clara said. I know. I wanted to say it again. She looked at him in the thin starlight. He was watching the road ahead, his profile quiet and unreadable in the way it almost always was. But she was learning to read the things that weren't in his face, the way his shoulders sat, the set of his hands on the reins, the quality of the silence he made when something mattered. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The little girl," she said carefully, "from the castor fire. Do you still—" She stopped, chose words. "Do you think about her?" A long silence. "Every day," he said. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would make that smaller, and she didn't want to make it smaller. She just let it sit between them, real and acknowledged, not wrapped in comfort that would have cheapened it. After a moment, Elias said, "She was 4 years old. Her name was Annie." "Annie," Clara said. "She liked cats," he said. "Her mother told me after. Told me not because she was angry. Well, she was angry, but she said it anyway. She said Annie would have been more worried about the barn cats than about herself." Clara felt something ache deep in her chest. "The Castor family left the valley the following spring," Elias said. "I sent them money for the travel, anonymously. I don't know where they went." "Of course you did," Clara said softly. He glanced at her. "What does that mean?" "It means that's exactly who you are," she said. "You paid a family money for a tragedy that wasn't your fault because you needed to do something, and that was what you could do. That's exactly who you are." Elias looked at the road again. "You see me in a very particular way," he said. He didn't say it like it was a complaint. He said it like it was something he was still getting used to. "I see you clearly," Clara said. "That's different." He didn't answer that, but his shoulders dropped half an inch, and she knew with the certainty of someone who had been watching a person very carefully that something in him had eased. Not everything. Not even most things. There was still so much ahead of them, Roger Dunn and Harlan Voss, and the stories that had been building in the dark for years. There was still a fight coming that neither of them could fully see the shape of yet. But the man next to her was not fighting it alone anymore, and whatever came next, that was going to matter. The horses found their way home in the dark, the way horses do when they know the road. The ranch house lights came up through the cold ahead of them, and Clara thought, "That's ours." It surprised her how much that felt like something worth protecting. Pete Hansen was not the last person they helped that January. He was just the first one who said it out loud. Word moved the way word always moved in a valley with one road and not enough to talk about quietly then all at once. Pete mentioned to his neighbor that Elias Blackwood had shown up with lumber and his wife and 4 hours of work and hadn't asked for anything. The neighbor told his wife. His wife told 2 women at the dry goods store. And suddenly there was a second story running alongside the old one, thin and new, against the thick dark weight of years but running. Elias noticed it before Clara did. He came back from town one afternoon with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not exactly confused, but close to it, like a man who has stepped on a floor he expected to give way and found it solid. "Bill Archer shook my hand," he said. Clara looked up from the kitchen table. "When he rang you up?" "No, when I came in." Elias set his hat on the hook by the door with the deliberate care he gave every small action. He came out from behind the counter and shook my hand and said he'd heard about the Hansen roof. "That's good," Clara said. "He's never shaken my hand," Elias said. He wasn't complaining. He wasn't even really commenting on it. He was just noting a fact that didn't match any map he'd been carrying. "People update their opinions when they get new information," Clara said. "Most of them anyway." Elias looked at her. "You sound like you expected this." "I did," she said simply. He sat down across from her, and she noticed he didn't pick up anything to occupy his hands the way he usually did, no harness to mend, no account book to check. He just sat. "It's strange," he said. "What is being seen differently?" He said it without self-pity, without drama, just the plain flat truth of it. "I'd gotten used to the other thing, not comfortable with it, just used to it. This feels—" He searched for the word. "Unfamiliar." "You'll get used to that too," Clara said. "Will I?" "If we do our jobs right," she said. He looked at her for a moment, with that expression that was becoming more familiar to her. The one that was almost a smile, where the warmth was present, but hadn't quite made it all the way to the surface yet. "Our jobs," he said. "You heard me," she said, and went back to the ledger. What she didn't say, and what kept her awake that night, was that Roger Dunn was not going to stand by while the story about Elias shifted underneath him. A man who had spent years building a case did not simply watch it start to crumble without responding. Clara had been waiting for the response since Dorothy's visit. She'd been watching for it the way you watch for weather when you know it's coming, not knowing what shape it would take, just knowing it would come. It came on a Friday morning in late January, and it didn't come quietly. Elias found the cattle first. He rode out at dawn for the morning check and came back 40 minutes later with his face set in a way Clara hadn't seen before. She'd seen him closed off, careful, distant. She'd seen the walls he built around himself when the world pressed in. But this was different. This was a man holding something in very tightly, because the alternative was too large to manage. "How many?" she said, because she could read it in him before he said a word. "6 head, he said. "North pasture. Someone cut the fence line on the far side and drove them out in the night. They could be anywhere by now." Clara set down what she was holding. "Was it just the cattle?" He looked at her. "The water trough on the north side. Someone put something in it. I don't know what yet. The cattle that were still there wouldn't go near it." "Is anyone sick?" "Not yet. I moved them off before anyone could drink." She took a breath. "All right." "There's more," he said. She waited. "Someone left a notice on the fence post by the main gate, typed, County Stationery." He reached into his coat and put it on the table. Clara picked it up and read it. It was a notice of concern. Not an official legal document, she could see that, but designed to look like one, designed to carry the weight of official process to someone who didn't look at it too closely. It stated that multiple residents of Raven Creek Valley had filed reports expressing concern about the safety of the Blackwood property and its occupant, and that a meeting of the County Land Committee would be held to review these concerns and determine whether action was warranted. The meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks out. "This is Roger Dunn," she said. "Yes," Elias said. "He's moved up his timeline," she said. "He wanted more time to build the case, more signatures, more names, but something changed. He's moving faster than he planned." "We changed it," Elias said. "Pete Hansen, Bill Archer, the story shifting." He sat down at the table with a heaviness that wasn't defeat. It was the weight of a man who had been here before, who had felt the ground give way before, who knew exactly how this felt, and was choosing not to run from it this time. Every person who stops believing the old story is one less person who'll sign his petition. So he stopped waiting for the petition. Clara read the notice again. "This meeting, can he actually do anything at it?" "Legally?" "I don't know," Elias said. "I don't know the legal side." "Then that's what we need to find out," Clara said. "Today." The only lawyer in Raven Creek was a man named Owen Pratt, who operated out of 2 rooms above the bank, and who was by general assessment a decent enough attorney who drank a little too much coffee and occasionally took cases he couldn't win out of principle. Clara had never spoken to him. Elias had never had reason to. They rode in together that afternoon, which was in itself something Raven Creek noticed and filed away. Elias Blackwood and his wife side by side in the wagon, with the kind of purposeful quiet that told anyone watching that this was not a social call. Owen Pratt was a short, precise man with spectacles, and the careful manner of someone who spent a great deal of time reading documents and not enough time among people who didn't. He read the notice twice, set it down, and looked up at them over his glasses. "This is not an official county document," he said. "I didn't think so," Clara said. "The formatting is close, but the county doesn't use this language for land reviews, and there's no case number, no assigned official." He tapped the paper. "What this is a privately organized meeting that someone has dressed up to look like county business. Whether that's legal depends entirely on what happens at the meeting. If someone files a formal complaint with the county office off the back of it, then it becomes a different situation." "Can we stop the meeting?" Elias said. Owen Pratt looked at him with the careful appraising look of a man who has heard many questions and is determining what's really being asked. You could challenge it. Write to the county clerk, put them on notice that this document is not official. That might slow things down, but it wouldn't stop someone from organizing a gathering of private citizens. And if the county does take it up, Clara said, if they file something formal, then you answer it, Pratt said, with documentation of your own. Property records which I assume are clean. He glanced at Elias. Clean, Elias said. Character witnesses, documentation of any improvements or contributions to the community. He paused. The difficulty with these situations is that they're designed to cost the defendant more than they cost the plaintiff. Filing concerns is cheap. Answering them is expensive. He looked at them both. Someone is betting that you won't have the resources or the will to fight it. Then they miscalculated, Clara said. Owen Pratt looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted slightly in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the professional equivalent of one. I'll write to the county clerk today, he said. And I'd suggest you start documenting everything that's happened on your property. The cattle, the water trough, all of it. Date specifics, physical evidence if you can preserve it. We'll start today, Clara said. They stood to leave. At the door, Pratt said, Mrs. Blackwood. She turned. I've been practicing law in this valley for 14 years. I've watched what's been done to your husband's reputation for most of that time. I should have said something sooner. He looked uncomfortable the way a man looks when he's making an admission he's owed for too long. I'm glad someone finally did. Clara looked at him steadily. Then help us, she said. That's what I intend, he said. The ride back was faster than the ride in. Clara's mind was moving faster than the horse. 2 weeks. They had 2 weeks before the meeting, and in 2 weeks, Roger Dunn was going to pack whatever room he could find with every person he'd been able to persuade or pressure or bribe. And he was going to try to make the case that Elias Blackwood was a threat that the community needed to address. He would have letters. He would have names. He would have Harlan Voss in the back of the room looking credible in a clean coat. And the only defense against that, the only real defense, was people. People who knew the truth. People who had seen something different from the story Roger had been building. People like Pete Hansen, who had watched Elias work for 4 hours in the cold without asking for a single thing. People like Dorothy Miller, who had seen the kind of woman Clara was and trusted her judgment. People who had over 11 years received quiet help from a man who never wanted credit and now desperately needed someone to say what he'd done. We need people at that meeting, she said. I know, Elias said. Not strangers. Not people you've vaguely done right by. People who will stand up and say something specific. I know, he said again. He was watching the road, his jaw set. Elias. He glanced at her. I need you to tell me everyone, she said. Everyone you've helped quietly. Every family who had supplies left at their door. Every fence you fixed every time you stepped in for someone who didn't know it was you. Every single one. A long pause. That's a long list, he said. Good, she said. He told her. It took most of the ride home and some of the evening after, and by the time he was done, Clara had 2 pages of the ledger covered in names, and Clara had a kind of anger in her chest that was different from the clean, purposeful anger of the courtroom. This was the anger of waste of years, of good done in silence by a man who thought silence was his only option. All of it sitting uncredited, while someone else built a case against him, using the same silence as evidence. You have been feeding half this valley, she said. Not half, Elias said. You repaired Will Sutton's barn after the hailstorm in July. You left medicine at the Prentice house when their children were sick in November. You paid off Tom Garrett's feed account in October. Tom Garrett, who is one of the people who might sign a letter against you. I didn't do it expecting anything back, Elias said. I know that, she said, but you might get something back anyway. She went to Tom Garrett herself. She didn't bring Elias, partly because Tom had a particular kind of male pride that would fold faster in front of a woman than in front of the man he'd convinced himself he resented. Partly because she needed to see what she was dealing with, whether this was genuine grievance, or Roger Dunn's engineering, or simple stubbornness. She rode out on a Thursday morning and knocked on Tom Garrett's door, and when he answered it, she said before he could set his face into whatever it was going to set into, "Mr. Garrett, someone paid off your account at the feed store last October. I think you deserve to know who did it." He stared at her. "What?" "Your feed account. Someone settled it anonymously. I know who, and I thought you should too." She looked at him steadily. "Can I come in?" He let her in. She told him. She watched his face move through several things in quick succession: surprise, skepticism, something stubborn, then something that was clearly not what he wanted to be feeling, a cracking open that a man like Tom Garrett would have called weakness if he'd named it. "He never said a word," Tom said. "No," Clara said. "He never does." "I blamed him for the cattle," Tom said. "The storm. I said things in town." He looked at his hands. "I said some things that weren't fair." "I know," Clara said. "I'm not here to make you feel bad about it. I'm here because there's a meeting in 2 weeks, and someone is going to try to take my husband's land from him, using the same kind of stories you've been repeating. And I think you should know what's actually true before you decide what side you're on." Garrett was quiet for a long time. "He went into that burning building twice," Clara said. "He pulled 2 children out. The third one—" She stopped, kept her voice even. "He couldn't get to the third one in time. And then he sent the family money for their travel anonymously because that was what he could do. And then this valley spent 3 years treating him like he was the one who started the fire." Garrett's face was very still. "I'll be at the meeting," he said. "That's all I'm asking," Clara said. By the end of the first week, she had spoken to 8 families. Some were easy. Pete Hansen already knew. Dorothy and Frank Miller were committed. A woman named Ruth Becker on the South Road had been receiving anonymous flour and sugar deliveries for 2 years since her husband had passed, and she'd cried when Clara told her who had been leaving them, and said she'd bring her 3 grown sons to the meeting. Some were harder. 2 families on the east side were cautious, not hostile, just frightened of what aligning with Elias might mean if Roger Dunn won. Clara couldn't entirely blame them. Roger Dunn owned a lot of things in this valley, and a man who owned things could make life difficult in small but relentless ways for people who crossed him. She didn't push. She laid out what she knew and left them to decide. One conversation she came home from and sat at the kitchen table without speaking for a full minute before Elias said quietly, "Who?" "Harvey Cross," she said. "Ah," he said. "He's already signed a letter for Dunn," she said. He wasn't mean about it. He was almost sorry. But he'd already signed it, and he'd told himself a story about why it was the right thing to do, and he wasn't going to unwind it. She looked at the table. Some people need to be wrong. It's part of how they hold themselves together. Elias brought 2 cups of coffee to the table and sat across from her. "Don't take it on yourself," he said. "I'm not," she said. "You are," he said. "I can see it. Every person who says no, you're adding it up." She looked at him. He was watching her with the direct, steady attention that she'd learned was simply how he looked at things. No performance, no softening, just the actual look of a person who was paying full attention. "It's not nothing," she said. "When someone chooses the wrong story over the true one." "No," he agreed. "It's not nothing, but it's not something you can fix by carrying it." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "When did you get wise?" "I've had a lot of time to think," he said. "Living alone suits a person for exactly one thing, and that's thinking." "What did you think about?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Whether I was what they said I was. Spent a lot of years going back and forth on that." "And," she said. "And I decided I wasn't," he said. "But I also decided it didn't matter much if nobody else agreed." "It matters now," she said. "Yes," he said. "Now it does." 6 days before the meeting, Everything collapsed. Or tried to. Elias rode in from the north pasture at midday, moving faster than usual, and Clara was at the gate before he'd fully stopped the horse. "What happened?" "Someone talked to the county," he said. He swung down. "Official this time. A formal complaint filed with the land office. A petition with 17 signatures claiming that the Blackwood property represents a hazard to the surrounding community based on—" He stopped, and Clara had never seen quite this expression on him before. Not anger, not defeat, something beyond both of them. Something that looked like a man watching a fire he'd fought for years finally breach the last wall. Based on neglect of land management, threatening behavior toward neighboring property owners, and involvement in a fatality on county land in 1880. The last 3 words landed like a physical blow. "Annie Castor," Clara said. "Yes," he said. His voice was flat and hard. "They went back that far. They found the inquest record, opened it back up, framed it as a covered-up negligence case." He was standing very still in the way he stood when he was holding something in that wanted very badly to come out differently. 17 signatures, Clara. I don't even know 17 people well enough to have offended them. Some of them won't be real," she said immediately. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Real enough to file. Owen Pratt. I already stopped at his office. He's working on the response. But Clara—" He stopped, looked at her. "If this goes through the land office, it becomes a different fight. It becomes a legal fight, and a legal fight takes time and costs money, and in the meantime they can file for an injunction on the property operations, which means I can't—" He shook his head. "It means the cattle can't be managed the way they need to be managed, which means losses I can't recover from." Clara stood with the full weight of this pressing down on her, and made herself breathe evenly. This was what Roger Dunn had been building toward. Not the meeting was cover distraction. The petition, the county filing the formal complaint, this was the real machinery. The meeting would give it public legitimacy. The filing would give it legal force. And together, they would squeeze Elias between public opinion and legal process until something cracked. "What does Pratt say about the Annie Castor inclusion?" she said. "He says it's the weakest part of their case," Elias said. "The original inquest cleared me. They'd have to challenge the finding. But challenging it means relitigating it, which means bringing the Castor family back into it, which means—" He stopped. Clara understood. Relitigating the fire meant putting a grieving family through it again. A family Elias had already sent money to because he couldn't do anything else for a 4-year-old girl named Annie who liked cats. He would not do that to them. Roger Dunn knew that. Roger Dunn was counting on it. "He's using your conscience as a weapon against you," Clara said. "Yes," Elias said. "Then we take that weapon away," she said. He looked at her. "The Castors," she said. "Where did they go? Do you know?" "I don't." "Then we find out," she said. "Before anyone else does." Owen Pratt found a forwarding address. In 3 days, the Castor family had settled in Cheyenne, which was close enough to matter. Clara wrote the letter herself, sitting at the kitchen table with Elias beside her, the two of them working over each word, with the care of people who understood that some words could not be taken back once sent. She did not ask the Castor family to defend Elias. She did not ask them for anything. She told them what was happening plainly, completely without softening or self-interest. And she told them that their name was being used in a legal filing without their knowledge, and she told them that they deserved to know so that they could decide for themselves what they wanted to do about it. She sealed the envelope. Elias put it on the mail run. Then they waited. 5 days before the meeting, something else broke. This one came from a direction Clara hadn't expected. Margaret Hendricks, who had been one of the first to talk when Clara made her proposal in the street, and who had not since then been either a supporter or an active obstacle, came to the ranch unannounced on a cold afternoon and knocked. Clara opened the door. Margaret looked at her with the expression of a woman who has made a decision she's not comfortable with, but has committed to anyway. "I have something I should give you," she said. She held out a piece of paper. Clara took it. It was a letter. Handwritten on Roger Dunn's personal stationery, Clara recognized the letterhead from a copy Owen Pratt had shown her. It was addressed to a man named Jeb Crawford, who was the deputy's older brother and the owner of a small parcel east of Elias's north boundary. The letter offered Crawford 40 acres of Dunn's own land, existing titled land, in exchange for Crawford's signature on the petition against Elias, plus Crawford's agreement to testify at the meeting that he had personally witnessed Elias Blackwood making threatening statements to neighboring property owners, in exchange for testimony about something that had never happened. "Where did you get this?" Clara said. "Jeb Crawford gave it to me," Margaret said. "He was going to sign it. The land would have helped him considerably, but he said he couldn't make himself write his name on something that would send a man to prison for things he never did." She paused. "He's a better man than I sometimes give him credit for." Clara looked at the letter. This was not rumor. This was not gossip building on gossip. This was evidence. "Margaret," she said, "would Jeb Crawford come to the meeting and say this publicly?" Margaret straightened slightly. "He said he would. That's why he gave it to me. He wanted it in hands he could trust." Clara looked up from the letter. "Why me? Why not take it to the sheriff directly?" "Because the sheriff plays cards with Roger Dunn every other Thursday," Margaret said with the dry flatness of a woman who had lived in this valley long enough to know exactly how it worked. "And because you married the man this letter is designed to destroy, and I thought that meant you might know what to do with it." Clara held the letter for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Margaret, truly." "Don't thank me," Margaret said. "I've done nothing for that man in all the years he's been in this valley, when I could have looked harder and seen more. This is—" She stopped. "This is late. That's all it is. Late." She left. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at the letter in her hand and felt the thing that had been an uphill fight for 2 weeks suddenly shift, just slightly, just enough in a different direction. Roger Dunn had made an error. He'd been so certain of Elias's isolation, so certain that the story he'd built was airtight, that he'd gotten sloppy. He'd put something in writing. And now it was in Clara's hands. She went to find Elias. She found him in the barn, and she walked in and held out the letter without a word and watched his face while he read it. She watched him read it twice. Then he folded it and held it and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. "He was going to pay someone to lie," Elias said. "Yes," Clara said, "about me threatening people." His voice was very quiet. "Yes." He looked at her, and for the first time since she had come to this ranch and started learning the particular language of Elias Blackwood, his silences and his stillnesses and all the things he said with his hands and his jaw and the exact angle of his shoulders, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not just relief, not just the shift of someone who had been waiting for the ground to give and found it suddenly unexpectedly solid. Something closer to belief. The beginning of it anyway. The very beginning of a man starting to believe that this time finally the truth might actually be enough. "Owen Pratt," he said. "First thing in the morning," she said. He nodded, folded the letter again, put it in his coat pocket with the careful, deliberate motion of a man securing something precious. Then he looked at her and said, "Clara." "I know," she said. "I mean it," he said. "I know you do," she said. "Now come inside. It's cold and we have work to do." He followed her out of the barn. Behind them the horse nickered softly in its stall. The night had settled in fully now, cold and dark, and heavy with everything still to come. But for the first time in longer than either of them could properly measure, Elias Blackwood walked toward his own house without looking over his shoulder. Owen Pratt read Roger Dunn's letter to Jeb Crawford 3 times before he set it down. Then he took off his spectacles, cleaned them with his handkerchief, put them back on, and looked at Clara and Elias across his desk with the expression of a man who has just watched a case change shape entirely. "This is bribery," he said. "Subornation of perjury. In writing. On his own stationery." "Yes," Clara said. "Roger Dunn is not a stupid man," Pratt said almost to himself. He was still looking at the letter. He's been careful for years. This is not careful. He was running out of time, Clara said. He'd built the case slower than he wanted, and when the story started shifting, he pushed too fast. Jeb Crawford will testify to receiving this. He will, Clara said. Pratt was quiet for a long moment, tapping one finger against the edge of his desk, in the steady rhythm of a man thinking hard. I can take this to Judge Holt this morning. With the petition filing the fraudulent county notice and this letter, we have grounds to challenge the meeting entirely and potentially file criminal charges against Dunn. He looked up. But I want you to understand something. Dunn has money. Money gets lawyers, and lawyers get delays. This doesn't end quickly, even if we move today. We don't need it to end quickly, Elias said. We need it to end right. Pratt looked at him for a moment. Yes, he said. That's the correct answer. He reached for his pen. I'll need Jeb Crawford in this office by this afternoon. And I'll need both of you available for Judge Holt's clerk whenever he sets the time. He paused. There's one more thing. Tell us, Clara said. The meeting is still happening in 3 days, Pratt said. Dunn called it, and it will proceed whether we file today or not. There's no legal mechanism to stop private citizens from gathering, even if the document that invited them was misleading. And he will be there with his people and his version of the story. He looked between them. You should be there too. Elias said nothing. Elias? Clara said quietly. I've never asked a room full of people to believe me, he said. I know, Clara said, but the room isn't going to come to us. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, the way he looked when he was having a conversation with himself that nobody else was invited to. Then he said, All right. Pratt nodded. I'll see you this afternoon with Crawford. Jeb Crawford was a lean, sunburned man of about 50, with the look of someone who had spent his life working harder than circumstances warranted and was tired of it without being broken by it. He came to Pratt's office that afternoon with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, and he told his part of the story in plain, spare language that did not try to make itself more dramatic than it was. Roger Dunn had approached him 6 weeks ago, had laid out the situation, the petition, the meeting, the land office filing with the smooth confidence of a man who had done this kind of thing before, had offered the 40 acres as compensation for testimony, had told Jeb it wasn't really lying, it was simply confirming what everyone already believed. That's the part that got me, Jeb said. He was talking to Pratt, but he glanced at Elias once. He said, confirming what everyone already believes, like it wasn't a lie because enough people had already told it. He shook his head. My daddy used to say a lie told often enough doesn't become truth. It just becomes a more comfortable lie. I thought about that. He told them he'd sat on the letter for 3 weeks, telling himself there was no harm in it, that Blackwood would land on his feet somehow, that it wasn't his business to get involved. And then he'd heard about the help with Pete Hansen's roof, and then he'd heard from his neighbor about the East Creek families, and something about the gap between what he knew about Elias Blackwood and what Roger Dunn was asking him to say had finally become too large to step over. Thank you, Elias said when Jeb was done. Jeb looked at him. I'm not doing it for you, he said, and then quickly, I don't mean that how it sounds. I mean I'm doing it because I can't be the kind of man who signs his name to a lie. It's not charity. I understand that, Elias said. I meant thank you for being that kind of man. Jeb Crawford looked at him for a moment with an expression that moved through several things quickly and settled into something plain and uncomplicated. He nodded once. I'll be at the meeting, he said. The 2 days before the meeting were the longest Clara had experienced since February on the mountain road. She kept moving because stopping felt dangerous. There were still people to reach, still threads to pull, still things that could go wrong in ways she hadn't anticipated. She went over the list of names with Elias every evening, and they tracked who had committed, and who was still uncertain, and who had gone quiet in a way that meant they'd made their decision and weren't happy about it. The letter to the Castor family had not received a response. She'd been checking for 3 days. Nothing. She didn't say anything to Elias about it. He hadn't asked, which told her he was thinking about it constantly. On the evening before the meeting, she was in the kitchen going over everything one more time when Elias came in from outside and sat down across from her without taking off his coat, which meant he'd come in specifically to say something. "What is it?" she said. "You should know that whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "the 6 weeks before, it'd have been different from the 11 years before them." He stopped. Tried again. "I want you to know that regardless of how tomorrow goes." Clara looked at him. "It's going to go right," she said. "Clara, I know it might not," she said. "I know Dunn might still have enough. I know the judge might not move fast enough to stop the land office filing. I know we might lose ground we can't recover." She held his gaze. "And I'm telling you, regardless of that, it's going to go right. Because we're going into that room with the truth, and people willing to say it, and that's more than you've ever had before." He looked at her steadily. "And if it's not enough, then we fight the next part," she said. "The same way we fought this part." A long silence. "We," he said. "Yes," she said. "We." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers for a moment. Just a moment, just that brief and certain as everything else he did. Then he stood up. "I'll check the horses," he said. "I know," she said. She sat at the table after he went out and looked at their 2 coffee cups and thought about what he'd said. 6 weeks different from 11 years. She understood what that meant for him better than he might have expected, because she'd had her own version of it, her own years of being looked at sideways, of having her situation define her before she'd opened her mouth, of being the woman with no land and no family and no future, rather than the woman who was capable of being something else. She'd just hidden it better. She'd learned to carry it standing up. Maybe that was why she'd walked up to Elias Blackwood in the middle of Main Street, because she recognized something. The particular set of a person who has been carrying something alone for too long and has gotten so used to the weight that they've stopped remembering what it felt like without it. She'd seen it because she'd worn it herself. The meeting was held at the Grange Hall, which was the largest public space in Raven Creek, and which was, by the time Clara and Elias arrived, fuller than either of them had expected. Clara counted quickly as they came through the door. 60 people, maybe more. Standing room along the walls. The winter outside was sharp, and the hall was warm with body heat and lamp oil, and the particular charged air of a room where everyone knows something important is about to happen, and nobody is entirely sure how it will go. Roger Dunn was already there. He was standing at the front of the room with 2 men Clara didn't recognize, not from the valley, she thought, which meant they'd come from somewhere else, which meant Roger had spent money on this. He was dressed in his good coat, and he had the composed, proprietary look of a man who has organized an event and expects it to go the way he planned. He saw them come in. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, but the recalibration of a man who had expected an outcome and is suddenly not entirely sure of it. It was there and gone in half a second, and then his face was composed again, and he turned back to the front of the room. Clara scanned the hall. Pete Hansen near the left wall. Dorothy and Frank Miller 3 rows back. Tom Garrett by the window with his arms crossed and his face set in the particular way of a man who has made up his mind and doesn't want anyone to see him second-guessing it. Ruth Becker with 2 of her 3 sons in the row behind. Jeb Crawford near the back, alone, his hat in his hands again. And in the corner near the back door, Bill Archer from the general store. He caught Clara's eye and nodded once. Not enough to guarantee anything, but more than she'd had last week. They took seats in the middle of the room. Clara was aware of the heads that turned to watch them. She kept her face forward and her hands in her lap and sat straight the way her father had taught her to sit when someone was trying to make you feel small. Roger Dunn opened the meeting. He was good at it, she'd give him that. He had a smooth, carrying voice and the practiced ease of a man accustomed to speaking in rooms, and he laid out his concerns. Their concerns. He said the community's concerns, as if the whole valley had arrived at this together, rather than being assembled and primed with the language of regret. He didn't want to be here, he said. He took no pleasure in this, he said. But the safety and stability of Raven Creek Valley required that certain difficult truths be addressed. He laid out the incidents, the fire, the fence lines, the stories of threatening behavior told in the passive voice so that the absence of specific witnesses was harder to notice. He did not mention the county filing that was already in motion, and he didn't need to. When he finished, he opened the floor. 3 men spoke against Elias in quick succession, clearly prepared, clearly rehearsed, saying variations of the same things in the same careful language. Clara listened to each one and felt the room absorbing it the way a room absorbs a story it already half believes. Then Owen Pratt stood up. He was not a dramatic man. He was short and precise, and his voice was not Roger Dunn's voice. It didn't carry the same warmth, the same practiced ease, but it carried something else. The exact particular authority of a man who is speaking in his professional capacity and knows precisely what he's talking about. He introduced the letter. He read it aloud. He read every word slowly and clearly, including Roger Dunn's name on the stationery and the description of the 40 acres and the language about what Jeb Crawford would be expected to say in exchange. The room went very quiet. Roger Dunn did not move. He stood at the front with his face arranged in an expression of polite confusion, but Clara was watching his hands, and his hands had tightened at his sides. "I have the original letter here," Pratt said, holding it up. "I also have Mr. Crawford's signed statement regarding when and how he received it. I have filed copies of both with Judge Holt's office as of this morning, along with a formal challenge to the County Land Office petition on grounds of fraudulent documentation and suborned testimony." Somebody in the back of the room said, "Lord Almighty." The polite confusion on Roger Dunn's face was starting to work very hard to stay polite. "I'd like to speak," Jeb Crawford said from the back. Heads turned. Pratt sat down. Crawford stood, and he was not a man who made speeches, and it showed, but he told it plainly what Dunn had offered him when what had been asked for in return, why he hadn't signed. "I've not always been fair to Elias Blackwood," he said toward the end. "I won't pretend otherwise, but I'm not going to lie about him in a public meeting because a rich man offered me land I need. That's where I draw the line." He sat down. Tom Garrett stood up next. Clara's breath caught slightly. Garrett was not a natural speaker. Either, his hands kept going in and out of his coat pockets, and he addressed the general space in front of him, rather than the room. But he said it. He said that he'd blamed Elias for lost cattle in a storm, and said things in town that weren't true and weren't fair. And he said that he'd recently found out that the same man he'd been saying those things about had quietly settled his feed account when things were thin, and he didn't know what that made him. But it made him unwilling to sit here and watch the wrong story win without saying something. He sat down. Pete Hansen stood up and said 4 sentences about a roof in January and a man who hadn't asked for anything. Ruth Becker stood up, and her voice shook only slightly when she talked about flour and sugar left at a door in winter by someone who never wanted to be thanked for it. Bill Archer stood up last and said simply that he'd been doing business in this valley for 20 years, and he'd watched how a man treated the people he didn't have to treat well, and that told you more about a person than anything else did, and what he'd seen of Elias Blackwood, he was not ashamed to say he'd been wrong about. The room had changed. Clara could feel it. Not all the way, not unanimously. There were still people in it who would walk out today, believing what they'd always believed because some people needed their stories too much to let them go. But the weight had shifted. The air was different. Roger Dunn stood up again. He was good, she thought, even now. He did not look rattled. He looked like a man responding to an unfortunate misunderstanding. "I think there's been some confusion," he began. "Mr. Dunn." Elias stood up. The room went silent in a different way. Clara had not known he was going to do this. He hadn't told her. He simply stood, and the height and the stillness of him in the room drew every eye the way a strong current draws everything toward it. And he waited until the silence was complete. "You've had 11 years to tell this valley your story about me," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it carried completely in the silent room. I'd like 3 minutes with mine. Roger Dunn said nothing. What could he say? Elias looked at the room. Not at any specific face, just at the room the way a man looks at something he's been avoiding and has finally decided to face. I came to this valley in 1872, he said, after my wife and my daughter died of fever in Colorado. I came here because I needed land to work and distance from everything that reminded me of what I'd lost, and that's the only reason I've ever kept to myself. Not because I don't care about the people around me, but because caring and losing is a combination that broke something in me, and I've spent 11 years trying to be careful about it. Nobody spoke. I went into the Castor house twice, he said. I want to say that plainly because someone decided that part of my history should be used against me in this room. I went in twice. I got 2 children out. I couldn't get to Annie in time. I will carry that for the rest of my life, and I don't need anyone in this valley to add to it. He paused. Clara was very still. I have not been where this valley thought I was, Elias said. I also haven't been what my wife has spent 6 weeks trying to show you I am. The truth is somewhere in the middle the way it usually is. I'm a difficult man who's been hurt enough times to stop expecting anything good. I'm trying to be different than that. He looked at the room steadily. That's all I have to say. He sat down. The room was completely silent for 3 full seconds. Then Dorothy Miller started to clap. It was not theatrical, it was not a wave. It was just Dorothy Miller clapping simple and deliberate, and then Frank Miller beside her, and then Pete Hansen, and then Ruth Becker, and her sons, and it spread through the room unevenly, not universal, not even a majority, but real, unmistakably real. Roger Dunn watched it happen. Clara looked at him. She'd been watching him through the whole of Elias's speech, and she'd seen at the precise moment when Roger Dunn understood that the room had moved past the point where he could control it. Not with his smooth voice, or his prepared arguments, or his money. The thing he'd spent years building had not survived the people who chose to say what they actually knew. He said nothing. His 2 men from out of town said nothing. The meeting adjourned without a formal resolution. Outside, afterward, in the cold, people gathered in the loose way they gathered after something significant, not quite sure what to do with what had happened, needing to stand near other people while they worked it out. Tom Garrett found Elias first. He walked up to him directly the way a man walks towards something when he's decided not to give himself time to change his mind. He put out his hand. Elias looked at it for a moment, then he shook it. I said things I shouldn't have, Garrett said. I'm sorry for it. You stood up tonight, Elias said. That counts. It should have happened sooner, Garrett said. Yes, Elias said. But it happened. Garrett nodded and stepped back. 2 other men came forward, then a third, some with words, and some with just the gesture of a hand extended, and Elias received each one with the same plain steadiness with which he did everything. Clara stood slightly to the side and watched him, and she felt something ease in her that had been tight for weeks. Not everything was done. The county filing still needed answering. Judge Holt's review of Pratt's challenge would take time. Roger Dunn, however, diminished tonight, was still a man with money and patience and a particular hatred of being beaten. He would not simply disappear. But tonight the valley had seen something. It had seen a man stand up in a room full of people who had believed the worst about him for a decade and tell the truth about himself without apology or performance. And it had seen that truth and the people willing to speak for it outweigh the manufactured story of a man who'd been building against it for years. That mattered. That mattered in ways that couldn't be easily undone. Margaret Hendricks appeared at Clara's elbow. He did well, Margaret said, watching Elias. Yes, Clara said. You both did, Margaret said. She paused. I owe you an apology, I think. I was one of the first people in this town to talk when you proposed to him. In the street. I made it worse. You came to me with the letter, Clara said. Late, Margaret said. Like I told you. Margaret, Clara said. Late is better than never, and never was what I'd gotten used to expecting. She looked at the older woman. "Don't carry it." Margaret looked at her for a moment, then made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "You know, when you first came to this valley, I thought you were a desperate woman who'd made a reckless choice." "I was," Clara said. "I just made it in the right direction." Margaret shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "You knew exactly what you were doing. That was the part none of us understood." She looked across at Elias, who was still talking with Tom Garrett. "You saw him when nobody else bothered to look." "He wasn't hiding," Clara said. "People just didn't want to see." Roger Dunn left the Grange Hall before most people. Clara saw him go. He moved through the thinning crowd with his two men close behind him, and his face arranged in the composed, indifferent expression of a man who has decided that what just happened will not be acknowledged as what it was. He did not look at Clara. He did not look at Elias. He looked, she thought, like a man adjusting his strategy. That meant it wasn't over. She found Pratt at the edge of the crowd. "He'll push the county filing," she said without preamble. "Yes," Pratt said. "Probably within the week. Tonight didn't stop that tonight was public opinion. The filing is process, and process doesn't care about public opinion. What do we need?" "Documentation of the property conditions. I need everything you have about what was done to the cattle and the water trough. Dated signed statements from anyone who can corroborate. And—" He hesitated. "What?" Clara said. "The Castor family," he said. "If they respond to your letter, if they're willing to put in writing that they don't support the inclusion of their daughter's death in a land dispute against the man who tried to save her, it would make the filing very difficult for Dunn to sustain." Clara looked at him. "We haven't heard back." "I know," Pratt said. "I know it's a hard thing to ask." "We didn't ask," Clara said. "We told them what was happening and let them decide." Pratt nodded. "Then we wait." They rode home in the dark the way they'd ridden home from Pete Hanson's roof side by side, the horses steady, the cold pressing from all directions. But this dark was different from that one, fuller somehow, more settled. For a long time neither of them spoke, and the silence was the kind that didn't need filling. Then Elias said, "I've never done that before." "Stood up in a room and said something true," Clara said. "Said something true to people who had every reason to believe otherwise," he said. He was watching the road ahead. "I kept waiting for— I don't know what I was waiting for. Someone to laugh, someone to say something, the way they always used to." "Nobody did," Clara said. "No," he said. "Because the truth looks different when people have already seen a piece of it," she said. Pete Hanson had seen it. Ruth Becker had seen it. Even Tom Garrett had seen it. He just needed to be reminded that he had. She paused. "You gave them things to hold on to over 11 years, Elias. You just never let them know it was you." He was quiet for a while. "My wife," he said. "My first wife. Before she died, she used to tell me I had a habit of giving people what they needed and then making it impossible for them to thank me. She said it was a kind of self-punishment, that I couldn't accept good things coming back." Clara felt the weight of that settle carefully. "She sounds like a wise woman," she said. "She was," he said. "She would have liked you." Clara looked at the dark road ahead and felt something in her chest that was too large for the moment and too right to dismiss. "What was her name?" she said. "Sarah," he said. "Tell me about her," Clara said, and he did. For the rest of the ride home, in the careful, sparse language of a man who doesn't waste words, he told her about Sarah, how they'd met, what she'd laughed at, how she'd made the Colorado ranch feel like a home, what the fever had taken in the span of 10 days in a summer that should have been ordinary. How he'd stood in that house afterward and understood for the first time that a place wasn't a home because of what it was made of. It was a home because of who was in it. He told her about the daughter, Eleanor, 3 years old when she died 2 weeks after her mother. He said her name once and didn't say it again, and Clara didn't ask him to. When they reached the ranch and he brought the horses in and Clara lit the lamps in the kitchen, there was something different between them that hadn't been there in the morning. Not romantic, not yet, not exactly, though she was beginning to understand that it might become that eventually in the slow and certain way of things that were built right rather than rushed. But something real, something earned. He came in from the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway, and he looked at her in the lamplight with an expression that was the most unguarded she had ever seen on him. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "You keep saying that. Because you keep meaning the same thing," she said. "And yes, I know." He stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he said, "I'll get the coffee," and came inside, and she moved to clear space at the table, and the house held them both in its warm and quiet way. Outside, the winter pressed its full weight against the walls. Inside, the lamps burned steady. And somewhere in Cheyenne, a letter sat in the hands of a family that had carried grief for 3 years. A letter that might or might not decide everything still to come. The letter from Cheyenne arrived on a Tuesday. Clara was in the yard when the mail rider came through, and she recognized the handwriting on the envelope from the address she'd sent her own letter to, and her hands were completely steady when she took it, which surprised her because she'd expected them to shake. She didn't open it alone. She carried it inside and set it on the table and waited for Elias to come in from the north pasture, and when he came through the door and saw her face, he stopped moving entirely. "It came," he said. "Yes." He looked at the envelope on the table. He didn't move toward it. "Do you want me to read it?" she said. "No," he said. "I'll read it." He crossed to the table and picked it up and stood there for a moment, just holding it the way a person holds something they've been afraid of for long enough that the fear has become part of how they understand the thing. Then he opened it. Clara watched his face while he read. She'd learned to read him the way she'd learned everything else about this man, slowly, attentively, through accumulation of small details rather than any single revelation. She knew the difference now between the stillness that meant he was simply thinking and the stillness that meant he was holding something very large, very carefully. This was the second kind. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the table and didn't say anything for a long moment. "Tell me," Clara said. "It's from Eleanor Castor," he said. "The mother. She says—" He stopped, pressed his lips together briefly. "She says she had no knowledge that her family's name was being used in a legal proceeding. She says she wants it made clear in any official record that she has never held Elias Blackwood responsible for what happened to Annie. That she was angry for a long time and said things she didn't mean, but she has known for 3 years that he did everything a man could do." He stopped again. "Elias," Clara said quietly. "She says Annie would have been glad to know someone tried," he said. His voice was entirely flat in the way it went flat when something was affecting him more than he intended to show. She says her other 2 children are grown now, and they remember being carried out of that house, and they know who did it, and they want him to know they know." The kitchen was very quiet. "She signed it with gratitude," Elias said. "Eleanor Castor." He stood very still for another moment. Then he sat down at the table and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them. And Clara saw his jaw work once, and she got up from her chair. And she did something she hadn't done before. She put her hand on his shoulder and left it there, solid and certain, not asking anything, just there. He reached up and put his hand over hers. Neither of them moved for a long time. Outside, a February wind was running hard from the north. Inside the kitchen, the stove was going, and the lamps were lit, and the letter from Eleanor Castor lay on the table between them and the thing that it contained. The 3 years of a grieving woman's journey from anger to something kinder. The 2 grown children who remembered being carried through smoke. The 4-year-old girl named Annie, who would have been glad someone tried all of it, was in the room with them, present and real. And finally said, "We take this to Pratt today," Clara said, when she trusted her own voice. "Yes," Elias said. He didn't move to take his hand off hers. She didn't move to take hers off his shoulder. "She called you by your name," Clara said. "In the letter. Not Blackwood. Elias." He nodded once. "That means something," Clara said. Yes, he said. It does. Owen Pratt read Eleanor Castor's letter with the focused, careful attention of a man who understood exactly what he was holding and what it meant for the case he'd been building. When he finished, he looked up. This closes the Annie Castor inclusion entirely, he said. Any competent judge will see that Dunn's use of the Castor inquest is not only legally insufficient, but was done without the family's knowledge or consent. I can argue bad faith on the entire petition. How fast can you move? Elias said. I'm presenting to Judge Holt Friday morning, Pratt said. With this letter, the Crawford evidence, the fraudulent county notice, and the documented property damage. He paused, laying the pieces out the way a man lays cards. I want to file for dismissal of the land office petition, and I want to file a criminal complaint against Dunn for suborning perjury. Separately. He looked at them both. The dismissal protects your property. The criminal complaint that's a different question. Meaning it might not succeed, Clara said. Meaning Roger Dunn has a good lawyer in Laramie who has kept him out of consequences before, Pratt said. The evidence is strong, but a criminal prosecution takes longer, and Dunn has resources to slow it. The property protection I'm confident about. The criminal charge. He spread his hands. We fight it, and we see. File both, Elias said. Pratt looked at him. File both, Elias said again. If it doesn't succeed, it doesn't. But he put a family's dead child into a land grab. That should at least be answered. Pratt nodded slowly. Yes, he said. It should. He filed both that afternoon. The 3 days before Judge Holt's review were the most suspended days Clara had experienced since the 3 days between her proposal and Elias's answer. Time thickened. Ordinary things, the morning chores, the accounts, the meals happened at a remove, like she was watching them through glass. Elias, to her surprise, was calmer than she'd seen him since all of this began. He worked the ranch the way he always worked it, steady and thorough and without waste. And in the evenings he talked more than he'd talked since she'd known him. Not about the case, about other things. About the herd and the spring calving plans and a section of the south fence he wanted to reinforce before the thaw. About a horse trader he'd heard was coming through the valley in March. Small things. The things a person talks about when they've decided to claim a future rather than just endure a present. She asked him about it one evening directly. You seem settled, she said. Considering. He thought about it. Eleanor Castor's letter, he said. What about it? It was the last thing I was afraid of, he said. Finding out she still blamed me. That part of this was going to use her grief against both of us. He looked at the middle distance. Once I knew that wasn't true, the rest of it felt manageable. Dunn is a problem. He's a serious problem. But he's a problem I can fight. I haven't been able to fight what I thought I'd done to that family. You didn't do anything to that family, Clara said. I know that, he said. But knowing something and believing it are different, and I couldn't entirely believe it until she said so. Clara looked at him. 11 years, she said. 11 years, he agreed. You carried that for 11 years without telling anyone. Who would I have told, he said. And it wasn't a complaint, just a fact stated plainly in the way he stated facts. Clara felt something move through her. Not anger, not grief. Something harder to name. The particular sorrow of understanding how much space a person can occupy alone that was never meant to be occupied alone. You can tell me things, she said. Going forward, you know that. He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to love without naming it, the one that was almost a smile. The one that happened in his eyes before it reached anywhere else. The warmth that had been there all along, under everything that life had buried it under. I know, he said. I'm still getting used to it. Take your time, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He held her gaze for a moment. No, he said. I don't believe you are. Judge Holt's review happened on a Friday morning in the courthouse in the county seat, which was 12 miles from Raven Creek, and which Clara and Elias rode to in the dark before dawn, arriving with Pratt, while the building was still cold and the clerk was still lighting the lamps. Roger Dunn arrived 20 minutes later with his lawyer from Laramie, a tall, silver-haired man named Carver, who had the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone who had never lost a case he considered important. Clara watched Dunn come through the door. He looked different from the Grange Hall, more contained, more careful. He'd had 3 days to recover and recalibrate, and he'd done it. The composure was back, the smooth surface restored. He glanced at Elias once when he came in, and then did not look at him again. His lawyer shook hands with Pratt with professional courtesy, and they took opposite sides of the room and waited. Judge Holt was a broad, deliberate man in his late 60s who had been on the bench for longer than most people in the territory could remember, and who had by general reputation a very low tolerance for anything that wasted his time. He came in, sat down, accepted the filings from both sides, and read them without speaking for 15 minutes while everyone in the room stayed extremely still. When he looked up, he looked at Roger Dunn's lawyer first. "Mr. Carver," he said, "walk me through the basis for the land petition." Carver walked him through it. He was good. Clara gave him that the same way she'd given it to Roger Dunn at the Grange Hall. He presented the complaints as a genuine community concern, framed the Crawford letter as a misunderstanding, and handled the Annie Castor inclusion by suggesting it was relevant historical context rather than a central argument. Judge Holt listened to all of it without expression. Then he looked at Pratt. Pratt was methodical. He went through the fraudulent county notice first, the language, the absence of case number, the deliberate design to make a private meeting look like official process. Then the Crawford letter, which he had Jeb Crawford himself read aloud from the witness chair, because Jeb Crawford was present, and because there was a difference between hearing a letter read and hearing the man who received it speak. Then Eleanor Castor's letter, which Pratt read himself in a quiet and even voice, and which landed in the courtroom, the way it had landed in Clara's kitchen, present and real and impossible to dismiss. When he finished, the courtroom was very quiet. Judge Holt looked at the Castor letter for a long moment. Then he looked at Roger Dunn, not at Carver. At Dunn himself. "Mr. Dunn," he said, "are you aware that the family whose deceased child's case you referenced in this petition has stated in writing that they do not support its inclusion?" Carver moved to respond. Holt held up a hand and kept his eyes on Dunn. Roger Dunn's face was very controlled. "I was not aware of Mrs. Castor's current position," he said. "I see," Holt said. He looked back at the papers in front of him. "I'm going to be direct because I have other business today. The land petition against the Blackwood property is dismissed. The grounds cited are insufficient. The supporting documentation is fraudulent, and the inclusion of a settled inquest record without the knowledge or consent of the affected family represents a bad faith filing." He turned a page. "On the matter of the criminal complaint for suborning perjury, Mr. Crawford's testimony and the letter to him are sufficient to proceed. I'm referring that to the county prosecutor's office for formal review." He looked up. "Are there questions?" Carver said. "Your Honor, I'd like to note for the record." "Noted," Holt said. "Good morning." He stood up. The clerk called the room to order. It was over. It had taken 45 minutes. Clara sat very still for a moment after Holt left the room. Then Pratt leaned over and said quietly, "The property is secure. Whatever happens with the criminal matter from here, the ranch is yours." She looked at Elias. He was looking at the table in front of him, both hands flat on the surface, the same way they'd been flat on the kitchen table when he'd read Eleanor Castor's letter. His face was composed and still, and giving nothing away, which was exactly what it always did when something was affecting him at a depth he didn't have language for. She put her hand on the table next to his. He looked up. "It's done," she said. He nodded once. Something moved through his eyes that she recognized now, the specific look of a man trying to believe something that he'd stopped letting himself believe in. "Elias," she said. "It's done." "Yes," he said. And for the first time since she had known him, Elias Blackwood looked like a man who had set something down and was not picking it back up. "Cut," Roger Dunn left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. His lawyer followed him out, and that was all. No final words. No attempt to reshape the moment. The smooth surface held all the way to the door, and then he was gone. Clara didn't watch him go. She'd said what she had to say about Roger Dunn in the Grange Hall that night, when she'd sat and listened to his version and then watched the room choose differently. That had been the moment that mattered, not this one. This one was just the legal mechanism catching up to what the truth had already decided. What she watched instead was Jeb Crawford accepting Elias's handshake in the courthouse hallway with the particular expression of a man who has done the right thing and is still slightly surprised by how it felt. "I'd have lost that land either way," Jeb said, meaning the 40 acres Dunn had offered. "I know," Elias said. "Wanted you to know I know that," Jeb said. "It wasn't a sacrifice." "It was still the right thing," Elias said. "Well," Jeb said, "someone told me once that being right and being easy don't often share a road." "Sounds like your daddy," Elias said. Jeb almost smiled. It was. They shook hands again, and Jeb went out, and Pratt collected his papers and shook hands with both of them and said he'd be in touch about the county prosecutor's timeline, and he didn't want them to expect a quick resolution on the criminal matter, but the petition was gone, and that was the thing that had been urgent. Then it was just Elias and Clara in the hallway and outside the courthouse windows. The February morning was bright and cold and completely indifferent to what had just happened inside. "Are you hungry?" Clara said. He looked at her. "It's been 4 hours since breakfast, and I would like to eat something before we ride back," she said. He let out a breath that was almost not quite but almost a laugh. "Yes," he said, "I'm hungry." They ate at the small restaurant 2 streets over from the courthouse, and they were unremarkable in it. A man and woman eating biscuits and gravy at a corner table, talking in low voices. Nothing about them that would make a stranger look twice. Which was, Clara thought, watching Elias eat, without the particular watchfulness he usually wore in public places, exactly as it should be. "What are you thinking about?" he said, catching her watching him. "Nothing dramatic," she said. "Just that you look different." "Different how?" "Like you're allowed to be somewhere," she said. He considered that. "I suppose I feel that way," he said. "You are," she said. In case that needed saying. He looked at her for a moment. "Clara, can I ask you something?" "Always," she said. "When you proposed to me," he said, "in the middle of Main Street, in front of half the town, were you frightened?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "Terrified." "You didn't show it." "I'd practiced," she said. "Every day for 3 weeks. I practiced not showing it." "Why?" he said, not challenging, genuinely curious. The real question underneath it, what made you keep going when you were afraid? "Because I'd seen what you were," she said. "That night on the mountain road. And I decided that a woman who was afraid of the wrong things was a woman who'd spend her whole life in the wrong place." She picked up her coffee cup. "I was afraid of what people would say. I was afraid of you saying no. I was afraid of looking foolish." She paused. "But I wasn't afraid of you, and that told me everything I needed to know." Elias looked at her for a long moment. 4 words, he said. "I'll keep you safe," she said. "I meant them," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said yes." Spring came. The way spring came in Wyoming. Not gently, not gradually, but in fits and surges. 3 warm days, and then a last freeze, the ground softening and hardening by turns, until it finally committed to the thaw, and the grass came through green and insistent, and the creek ran high with snowmelt. The calving season kept both of them moving from before dawn until after dark for 3 weeks, and it was the hardest work Clara had done since her father's farm, and she went to bed each night with her hands aching, and her back complaining, and slept the solid, dreamless sleep of someone who has done exactly what needed doing. The roan heifer she'd noticed on her first day at the ranch delivered a calf on a Tuesday morning, and it was a strong calf, dark-coated and unsteady on its legs, for exactly 20 minutes, before it figured out the standing situation and stopped being concerned about it. Elias stood at the stall door and watched it, and Clara stood next to him and he said, "She was the one you noticed? First week." "I remember," Clara said. "Good eye," he said. "My father's eye," she said. "I just inherited it." He looked at her sideways. "No, yours. You can inherit a skill and still make it yours." She thought about that. "All right," she said. "Mine then." Yeah. The county prosecutor's office moved slowly, which Pratt had promised them it would. Roger Dunn's lawyer filed objections, and the objections were reviewed, and Carver was as good as his reputation, and the process ground along through March and into April, at the pace of something that had all the time in the world. But it moved, and the land was not in question. The ranch was not in question, and Roger Dunn, for the first time in 11 years, had no mechanism left to reach Elias Blackwood with. He stayed in Raven Creek. He still owned his lumber operation. He still had money, and he still had standing, though the standing had developed a particular crack in it, that even his money couldn't fill the kind of crack that comes when people know something about a person that the person would prefer they didn't know. The Crawford letter had moved through the valley the way everything moved through it. People knew. They would go on doing business with him because that was how things worked, but they knew. That was, Clara thought, its own kind of consequence. On a Tuesday in April, a month and a half after Judge Holt's ruling, Clara was in the kitchen when she heard horses coming down the road faster than ordinary traffic. She came to the door and saw Elias already in the yard, shading his eyes to look. 2 riders, moving with purpose. They pulled up at the gate and Clara recognized the older one first. A broad woman with gray-streaked hair and a steady, composed face that had the look of someone who had cried all the tears available to her on a particular subject and had come out the other side of them. The younger 2 she recognized a half-second later. A man of perhaps 25, a woman a few years younger. The Castor children. Grown, as Eleanor Castor's letter had said. Grown and here. Elias had gone very still in the yard. Eleanor Castor dismounted first. She walked toward Elias with the directness of a woman who had made a decision at great cost and was not going to let herself slow down. She stopped in front of him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she said, "I wanted to say it in person. The letter wasn't enough." Elias's jaw was tight. "Mrs. Castor, I blamed you," she said. "For 2 years I blamed you. I know I said in the letter that I'd known for 3 years it wasn't true, but I want you to understand before that I blamed you. And I said things. Things that got back here and made your life harder. And I need you to know that I know that, and I'm sorry for it." The 2 younger Castors had dismounted and were standing a few feet back. The young man, Clara thought he was probably 25 or 26, which would have made him about 9 when the fire happened, was watching Elias with an expression that was open and complicated and younger than his face. "You carried her out," the young man said. I remember you carried her out first before you came back for me and my sister." Elias looked at him. Something in his face shifted in a way Clara had never seen before. Not the controlled shift of a man managing his expression, but something involuntary, something that happened before he could decide to let it or not. "I couldn't," he started. "I know," the young man said. "I know you went back. I know you couldn't." He stopped. "I was 9 years old and there was smoke everywhere, and I was terrified, and you came out of that smoke, and you picked me up and you carried me out, and I have known my whole life since then that there was a man who did that, who came back." His voice was steady, but it cost him something to keep it that way. "I wanted you to know that I know." His sister, who had not spoken yet, stepped forward and put out her hand. Elias looked at it for a moment, then he shook it. "My name is Ada," she said, "in case you didn't know it." "I knew it," Elias said. "Good," she said simply. Eleanor Castor was watching Elias with the eyes of a woman who had traveled a long road to arrive at something she couldn't have named at the beginning of it. "Will you show me your ranch?" she said. "I'd like to see what you've built." Elias looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the property and said, "This way." They stayed for 3 hours. Clara made coffee, and then made more coffee, and somewhere in the middle of it, she realized that Elias had been talking for 2 hours, talking to Eleanor Castor about the calving season and the fence line, and the particular difficulty of the north pasture in heavy winter. And Eleanor had been talking back about the small farm outside Cheyenne where she'd resettled, and the fact that her son was about to buy his own land, and her daughter had married a school teacher. Ordinary things. The ordinary things of lives that had continued. Clara sat at the kitchen table with Ada Castor, and they talked about other things, smaller things, the way women sometimes talked around the large thing in the room, until the large thing became less large, and Ada was funny and direct and had her mother's steady eyes. And at one point she looked at Clara and said, "You wrote a very good letter." "I was scared to send it," Clara said. "It was a scary letter to receive," Ada said. "I'm glad you sent it." When they left in the late afternoon, Eleanor Castor hugged Clara briefly at the gate, which surprised her and which she was glad of. The young man, his name was Daniel, shook Elias's hand again and said something low that Clara didn't hear. Whatever it was, Elias nodded. They rode out the way they'd ridden in the three of them, moving together down the road until the distance took them. Elias stood at the gate for a long moment after they were gone. Clara came and stood next to him. Neither of them said anything for a while. "Daniel told me she talked about me every night for a year," Elias said. "Annie. She told stories about the barn cats to anyone who would listen." "She sounds like a wonderful little girl," Clara said. "Yes," he said. "She does." He looked down the road where the Castors had gone. The afternoon was going golden at the edges, the way April afternoons went warm and wide, the mountains clear against the sky, the valley floor green and settled with the new grass. "I've been carrying her for 3 years," he said. "Annie. I've been carrying her like a verdict." "I know," Clara said. "She would have been glad I tried," he said. "Her mother said so. Daniel said so." He stopped. "That doesn't make it smaller. It just makes it different. Something I did, rather than something I failed at." Clara looked at him. "She was 4 years old," he said. "She deserves to be remembered as the little girl she was, not as the proof of something I couldn't prevent." He turned to look at Clara. "I think I can do that now." "Yes," Clara said. "You can." He put his arm around her shoulder, then not dramatically. Not as a gesture, but the way he did everything directly without performance because it was the true thing to do, and he'd decided to do it. She leaned into him slightly, and they stood at the gate of the ranch that was theirs, and looked out at the valley that had spent 11 years defining him by the wrong things. "They'll tell different stories about you now," Clara said. "People here, they already are." "I know," he said. "Does it feel different?" she said. "Being seen, right?" He thought about it the way he thought about things carefully, without rushing to the answer he was supposed to give. "It feels like something I have to get used to," he said. "Like a coat that fits properly when you've been wearing one that doesn't for so long you thought the discomfort was normal." "Take your time," she said. "You keep saying that to me," he said. "You keep needing to hear it," she said. He made the sound that was almost a laugh she'd learned to love, that sound. The almost laugh, that was the version of Elias Blackwood that 11 years of living inside a bad story hadn't entirely reached. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "When you walked up to me on Main Street," he said, "you said you'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks." "Yes," she said. "What made you decide?" he said. "Specifically. Not the practical reasons. The real one." She thought about it. "The morning after the mountain road?" she said. "I woke up and you were already gone. You hadn't asked for my name. You hadn't asked for anything. You'd just done what you came to do and left." She paused. "And I thought a man who helps a stranger in a snowstorm and doesn't stay to be thanked is a man who does the right thing because it's the right thing. Not because anyone is watching. Not because he wants something for it. She looked up at him. I've known men who perform goodness, and men who do it. You do it. And I decided that a man like that was worth walking up to in the middle of Main Street and making a fool of myself for. He was quiet for a long moment. You didn't make a fool of yourself, he said. Almost, she said. Almost, he agreed. They stood a while longer at the gate. The sun finished going golden and moved toward the long blue light of the evening, and the valley settled into its evening sounds. The cattle calling across the pasture, the horses moving in the barn, the creek running high with the last of the snowmelt, all of it theirs. I should check the north pasture before dark, Elias said. I'll start dinner, Clara said. He turned to go. Then he stopped. He turned back and looked at her with the most direct, undefended look she had seen from him. Yet all of it, no walls, no management. Just Elias Blackwood, looking at the woman who had walked up to him in the middle of a street and told the truth. I'll keep you safe, he said. The same 4 words he'd said that first day, but different now. Not a promise being made to a stranger, not a man trying to find something to offer. Something else entirely. Something that had been built over months of early mornings and hard winters, and letters to Cheyenne and courthouse hallways, and a kitchen table, where 2 people had learned how to tell each other the truth. I know you will, Clara said. He went to check the pasture. She went inside to make dinner. And in Raven Creek Valley, the story people told about Elias Blackwood began to change. Not overnight, not all at once, but steadily and surely, the way anything changes when enough people decide that the truth matters more than the story they're used to telling. The man they had called a monster turned out to be the man who went back into the fire twice. The man they had called dangerous turned out to be the man who fixed fences and left flour at doors and carried children through smoke without asking for anything in return. The woman who had chosen him turned out to have known something the whole valley hadn't bothered to learn. And the 4 words he'd said on a cold street in front of a speechless town, the words everyone expected to be rejection or cruelty, or something that confirmed everything they believed about him, turned out to be the truest words spoken in Raven Creek in 11 years. I'll keep you safe. He did. And so did she. That was how the man everyone ran from became the man a whole valley finally learned to see. Because one woman refused to look away, and because the truth, when someone finally decides to stand behind it, is stronger than any story ever built against it.